So again, I just want to welcome everybody to the Independence Breakthrough, and we have Anne Marie here with us. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Anne Marie. And Anne Marie is a board-certified educational therapist living up in the San Mateo area in California. And I was following some of Anne Marie's work. She does a lot of blogging, and I really enjoy the work that she does. She's doing some great stuff. So I asked her to come on and do a webinar for decoding dyslexia, and Learning Ally is hosting our webinar tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it right over to her. Before I do that, I want to let you know that Mariah from Learning Ally is in our chat box. She will be answering questions and kind of fielding things out and getting ready for the end session. So if you have anything you want to say, go ahead and put it in there. And Anne Marie, I'm going to go ahead and turn it right on over to you. I think you might still be muted, Anne Marie. There you go.
Okay, there we go. I think I've unmuted myself.
You have.
Can you guys hear me now?
I can hear you. Sounds
Okay,
great.
perfect. Well, thank you
Okay.
so much for that introduction.
Absolutely.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Okay,
I'm so
here we
glad to hear that. You know, I was telling my students it's so funny to be giving this presentation, and there's these people that we're having a conversation with, but it's like I'm alone by myself in a room. So it feels a little bit funny, but I'm just sort of imagining all of you here in my teeny office, and we're just having a conversation. But thank you, Jennifer, so much for that introduction.
Absolutely.
And I really appreciate Learning Ally and Decoding Dyslexia for all of the work that both organizations do, and I so appreciate being here today because I think we're all united in a mission. Whether we're educators or we're parents, we are in the business of building grown-ups. And what does it mean to be a grown-up? We want our children to grow up and be happy and lead satisfied lives and to give to others. And a key piece of that is that we're hoping that they're going to grow up and be independent. And we know that independence is a route for joy. I mean, how do you feel when you're independent, when you complete a project that you didn't think you could do, whether it's a recipe or a crossword puzzle or a new software program? There's this feeling of joy and satisfaction and motivation. And that's the feeling that I want all of the students that I work with, no matter how they learn, if they have a learning disability or a learning difference, I want them to have those feelings. And yet, for so many of our students who learn differently, no matter how great their skills are or their strategies are, sometimes that independence, that joy, that motivation of working alone, of figuring it out, seems like it's elusive and they can't get there. And that's why I wanted to share these strategies. I'm so appreciative of you guys for being here tonight. And these are strategies that are backed by research, the latest psychological and educational research. And they're also strategies that I use in my private practice, where I work one-on-one with students in elementary school all the way through high school. And you don't need to buy any books. You don't need to get any programs. These are just strategies. And I'm hoping by the end of our presentation today, you will have something you can take home and you can use tomorrow. Okay, so I created this presentation for kids who avoid working alone, who get easily distracted, they turn in incomplete work, they race through their assignments, and they give up easily. A few years ago, I was working with a student, and we had achieved all of his goals. He was reading beautifully, he was able to write a paragraph on his own, his spelling had come along, and I called up his mom and I said, Michelle, I think we have reached that moment where it's time to graduate from educational therapy. And she said, Anne Marie, I absolutely agree with you. I think he's come so far. But when we're working at home alone, when we're at home doing homework, he doesn't ever want to work by himself. And he demands that I sit next to him every day on every assignment because he's terrified of doing it by himself. And that's when I had that light bulb moment, realizing it just isn't just about skills and strategies. It's also got to be about the independence as well. Now, before I dive in, I just want you to keep in mind that if your child or student can't perform these tasks that they're being asked to do, these methods alone aren't going to work. We have this little guy here on his bicycle, and no matter how much he wants to bike, he's not going to be able to do it until his chain is on there and he's got a seat. So that's the idea. If we're asking a 6th grader to read the class novel, but he's reading at a 2nd grade level, this isn't going to work. Also, For a lot of these students who have challenges working alone, oftentimes there might be executive function challenges. And you might know this if you have a child who has a really hard time organizing himself, or he gets really distracted. And if this might be a child in your life, I'd recommend starting with my favorite book on the subject, which is called Smart but Scattered, and the authors are Dawson and Guare. And then finally, we've got some wonderful experts here with us, and I know Jennifer will talk a little bit about this at the end, but you can always consult with a parent support specialist. Okay, so what is the #1 reason why kids avoid working alone? I've been in the field now for 7 years working with kids with LD, and the one thing that seems to unite all of them is that they are terrified of making mistakes. So I'd ask you, how do you feel when you make a big mistake, especially if it's in front of your peers? Do you feel embarrassed, ashamed, angry, defensive? We might feel all of those things, and our students might too, but in addition, if they have some sort of learning difference, they can see their mistakes as evidence that they're not smart, that they're not talented, that they're not as good as their peers. And I had a 4th grader once who was revising with his teacher, and I said, why is revising so hard for you? And he said, every time she revises my work, I feel like she's throwing it away like trash. So the stakes were so high for him. The stakes were so terrible. And yet, we know that mistakes are really important for learning. So our first secret to helping kids become more independent and motivated is to reframe mistakes for them. Because we know mistakes are so important. They're actually a requirement for learning. We know that when kids are making mistakes, it shows that they're at the edge of their comfort zone. They're not doing something too easy for them. They're able to grow from what they're doing. And in fact, recent research has shown that mistakes give us opportunities for growth and neural development. So we've got to have those mistakes. You know, my niece Olivia is just over a year old, and she's just starting to walk right now. And I've had the most fun observing her as she moves through this process, because every day she gets up and tries again and again and again, and she makes mistakes over and over and over again, and yet we continue to encourage her. And somewhere along the line, we stop letting mistakes be okay. So how do we change this? How do we create a culture where we allow kids to make mistakes? Well, the very first thing we do is we just convey our expectations. When I start with students, we have an initial intake session. And in that first session, we talk about mistakes and how they help your mind grow and they help you learn. And I say to them, I'm going to be expecting you to make mistakes. Is that something that you're willing to do? Is that something you'd be okay doing in this office with me? And if they say yes, then I know we're going to be able to work together. In other classes, I know teachers have put up posters saying, we love mistakes. Mistakes show that you're learning. And I even know a 2nd grade teacher, and he has taught his students to applaud for one another when they make a really interesting mistake. We can also reward the process of learning, not the product. The researcher I was talking about on the last slide, Joe Bowler, says that we've turned school into a performance event. We can share our own experiences with making mistakes, which requires us to be a bit vulnerable, which is sometimes hard with students or with our own children. A few months ago, I guest posted on my first blog, and I was so excited to do it. And it was a post all about how to help kids with dyslexia in the general ed classroom. And it was very well received, and it got all these shares on Facebook, and I was so excited. And then I got an email from someone at Learning Ally. And I think tip number 23 was to pursue assistive technology. And I had misquoted something about Learning Ally, and she emailed me to let me know and ask if I could make a change. And I was so embarrassed when I got that email. And I was by myself, but I could feel my cheeks turning so red. But then what was so interesting is I told my students about this experience. And I said to them, and you wouldn't believe the next email I received from this nice woman at Learning Ally. She was inviting me to write an article on the website, something I never would have dreamed that I would have a chance to do. And they gave me this look, this sort of wide-eyed look, like, A, I can't believe Anne-Marie made a mistake like that. And B, they were so surprised to hear that a mistake led to such a wonderful opportunity. And really, it's how we ended up all here together tonight. So you can share your own stories. You can also share stories that are just part of our culture. I think some of us use WD-40. It's a great tool to have in your garage. And I don't know if you know what it stands for, but it took the chemists 40 tries to get it just right. And that's why it's called water displacement number 40. So you can share stories like that. You talk about penicillin, Teflon. Just do a Google search. You'll get all sorts of great ideas. We can, as for teachers, we can change assignments, which means open-ended assignments tend to work much better because there's not just one right answer. Mistakes are part of the process. We can also just grade the process instead. So many of my students hate doing outlines. They see them as irrelevant and pointless. And yet, if we start grading them, if we start grading our students' drafts, we show that we value their effort and the process of learning, not just the outcome. And then finally, we can give wise feedback. And we'll talk a little bit about more how to do that. So sometimes talking just doesn't seem to get through to our students, and that's when I like to use YouTube. So if you look up growth mindset or mistakes on YouTube, you'll get all sorts of great videos like this and others that don't have, the product placement from Nike if you want to skip that. Okay, so on our last slide, we talked about the idea that there's different ways to give feedback to our students. And I know for me, one of the things that I struggle with is how do you give critical feedback to a student who already feels pretty vulnerable? How do you give feedback that doesn't sap their motivation and their self-confidence? Well, one of the things I like to think about is how much of the feedback I'm giving my students, how much of it is dead end and how much of it is wise. So when I mean dead end feedback, I mean a student comes to us, we're editing their work, we're looking at their math problems, and we notice a mistake. And they say things like, we can say things to them like, that's wrong. And the message that comes through when we say that's wrong is that your final product is inadequate. And your effort leading up to this moment doesn't actually really matter that much. And for a lot of us, and I'll confess I'm one of those people, when we get that feedback that we've made a mistake, sometimes it's hard to see that it's the mistake, it's not about us. So with a lot of our students, when we say that's wrong, we can end up getting the message that I'm wrong, that I'm the one that's made a mistake. And I think the final outcome to that is when we get that kind of feedback is that it really saps the desire to work alone. It really saps that motivation and the kids don't want to try again. And when we get feedback like that, really, it's about evaluation. It's really about testing kids. Now, instead, if a student comes to you and they've made a mistake, you don't have to say this all the time, but every now and then, what would happen if you said something like, gosh, that's a really interesting mistake. I'm really glad you made that mistake. Because the message then becomes that the child's effort is important, that they're doing well, and hopefully they're going to want to go back and do the work again. They're going to want to make it better. So this is a great strategy if you have a child who can't stand have revisions done. I know a lot of families have meltdowns over the revision process for essays. Try this instead. Like, gosh, that's really interesting what you've done here. Could you also try doing this as well? Because instead of evaluating and testing our students, we're coaching them. And that feels so different. So let's see what this looks like in the real world. So this is a spelling example from a second grader that I was working with a few months ago. He wrote me this sweet letter saying that he loved when we acted out an elephant and piggy book. And he and I sat down together and I said, gosh, that's a really interesting way to spell the word acted, and I'm so glad you made this mistake. And I always like to start with something positive if I can. And I said, I love how you included that suffix at the end. I love that ed suffix. It shows me that this happened in the past. And then we can look at the way that you represented that sound k in the word act. I love that you heard that sound. Now, what can you tell me about the letters CK? What can you tell me about where you find those two letters in a word? And leading the child through the process, I can discover what he knows and what he doesn't know about spelling, and we really have an opportunity to engage in this. And what's the most exciting is that once you have this conversation, kids are so excited to go back to their work and to try again. You know, I have to admit that I really consider myself a recovering perfectionist. But ever since I've started really focusing on reframing mistakes with my students, I've really seen a transformation in their work. And I've also heard from their teachers and their parents that they're able to work much more independently and to stick with projects when they get frustrated. So I hope you'll take this home and try it as well. Okay, so let's talk about our next strategy, which is using wise words with our students. Because we want to be able to give both critical feedback and praise to kids. It's really important. And we know that words are cheap. They don't cost us anything, and yet they're so enduring. Think about your own childhood. Think about your own teachers. Can you still remember some of the things they said to you? Maybe the positive things? And I bet some of the negative things have stuck with you decade over decade over decade. You know, a few weeks ago I was visiting a 5th grade class, and I went to go talk to the teacher and said, you know, how is this student doing with his state report? It's a big project they're working on. And she said, oh, Anne-Marie, his spelling is awful. The mechanics are all over the place. I can't believe it. He has no proper nouns capitalized. And there's just zero elaboration in all of his work. And this just went on for maybe another 20 or 30 seconds. And what I noticed in myself was that my own motivation, my own feeling of optimism about the student was really diminishing. So how do we give feedback? Because it was really important information from this teacher. How do we get the feedback in a way that motivates our kids to keep working? So how do we use that language that inspires our group, especially around critical feedback? This is a suggestion from Carol Dweck, and it's a single word you can use, yet. You know, you're not there yet with your thesis statement, because the word yet implies that there is a trajectory of growth. You're not at the best yet, but you're going to get there. We also want to express our high expectations and belief in a child's potential. So what exactly do I mean by that? There was a study done just in 2013, and it's a great study, really, really interesting, about how do you give critical feedback to promote self-confidence and motivation. And it was a randomized controlled study of 7th graders. And all the 7th graders wrote an essay. Half of them got their feedback, so all the words that were misspelled, what they needed to rewrite, and they just got that back. And then the group that was in the experimental group, the group that the experimenters were trying to see about this intervention, they got the same kind of feedback, the same sort of revisions, but at the very bottom of their essay it said this: I am giving you this feedback because I believe in you. One sentence, and you'll never believe the outcomes. The children who were in the experimental group were more likely to turn in essays with revisions, so they were likely to just keep going, and the revisions that they turned in were better than their peers in the control group. So I am giving you this feedback because I believe in you. What a powerful sentence to use with our students. Okay, now what about positive feedback? How do we give our students praise? And the work that I'm going to be talking about on this slide is done by Carol Dweck, who's a researcher at Stanford, who's done some work around mindset. And the idea that we can think about people in sort of 2 groups, and that we can have a group of folks that have sort of a fixed mindset. You are as smart as you're ever going to be. You are as good a speller as you're ever going to be. And then we have a group that has a growth mindset. And these individuals tend to believe if they work really hard, they're going to get better at something. Now here's the interesting thing. Those individuals who have a growth mindset are more likely to persevere. If they make a mistake, they're going to keep going. And interestingly, they choose to do harder, more demanding tasks because they know that's going to help them grow. So how do we help our students and our children develop a growth mindset? Well, it's all about the praise. Now, a lot of the students I work with have just been diagnosed with some sort of learning disability. And several years ago, I was talking to a family, and their son was in 1st grade, really a bright young man, but he was just so upset every night when it came to homework, and he would just melt down. He was so sad. There were tears every night. And the mom said to me, Anne-Marie, I don't know what to do because I keep telling him he is so smart. You're so smart. You can do this. And it doesn't seem to be helping. And what I had to tell her is that maybe the praise could be a little bit different, because when we tell kids they're smart, that's sort of sending a fixed mindset idea to them. But instead, we could send them this growth mindset. And this is some ways you can do that. You can say things like, I like the detail you added to the people's faces in your drawing. You studied all week for your social studies exam. Your hard work really paid off. that was a hard English assignment and you stuck with it. That takes persistence. And I love to use these high-level words like persistence because I want students to be able to describe what they're doing when they're doing it well. I'm being persistent right now when I stick with this. And I'm impressed that you took on that challenging project for science. You are going to learn so much. If you find that this is resonating, just like this idea of a growth mindset, you can get better at this. And I can recommend highly this book, Mindset. It's been a bestseller for a number of years now. It's a very accessible book. If you're looking for something a little bit more pre-packaged, programmed, you can purchase this online program called Brainology, and I've heard some really good things about it. So Salman Khan, who is the creator of Khan Academy, is a huge proponent of this idea of a growth mindset. And he was talking about in a blog post a year ago that his son was just learning how to read. And of course, that means you come to words that are really hard. You've never met before. You don't know how to read them. And he came to the word gratefully. And his son really struggled over it. And Khan said it was really painful for him to watch his son struggling, but he just let him do that. And then his son figured it out, and he said to him, "Dad, aren't you glad how I struggled with that word? I think I could feel my brain growing." Okay, so in addition to thinking about our criticism, our critical criticisms and our praise, we can also think about some words that we may not want to be using with our students. Sometimes it's as helpful to know what not to say as what to say. And the first thing is self-disclosure. And this is really interesting because we were talking about being vulnerable and sharing in our mistakes, but there's too much information that we can give students. There's a study done by Sion Bylock and her peers in 2010. And they studied a group of first and second grade kids. And they studied their math ability. And in the beginning of the year, there was no difference whatsoever in the girls and the boys. And then at the end of the school year, the boys were outperforming the girls. And they were trying to figure out what was going on with the girls. Why weren't they doing as well? Their potential was just as much at the beginning of the school year. And what they discovered is that those girls who had had a teacher, a female teacher, who had math anxiety, who felt really nervous and worried about her ability to teach math and communicated that in some way to her students, those girls got some sort of message that women aren't as good as at math and their performance declined. So that can sound really dire. It turns out, too, from Bylock's study that just teaching teachers about this and giving better mathematics education and continuing ed really closes this gap. But we want to be careful with self-disclosure, especially to children of the same gender as us, apparently. We don't want to tell kids that work is a necessary evil. You know, I know you don't really like algebra, but you just got to do it because you're going to need it later on in high school. Well, you know, kids are much more living in the present than we are. This isn't relevant to them. So we've got to find a way to make the work they're doing today relevant to their personal goals right now. One of the things we really want to avoid is telling kids, it's okay if you're not a good speller. Because thinking back to that idea of a fixed mindset, that if we tell kids this kind of message, we're trying to be kind, but we're saying it's okay if you're really stuck this way. And then finally, this is a suggestion I got from a cognitive behavioral psychologist, is that we may want to avoid using the word try. It seems like such a simple, teeny tiny word, but the word try conveys the idea that you might not be able to do this. So instead, we can use the word do. I'd like you to do this now. All right, so let's talk about our third secret. And now we're really moving into this realm of self-regulation, and there's some wonderful research about this, about self-regulation being so important for children with learning disabilities and learning differences. So let's talk about the importance of goal setting. Why do it? First off, we know that effective learners are goal-oriented. It answers that question of why we were just talking about. So this is an example of a word matrix that I would use with students who are working on decoding longer words and spelling longer words. And we have this RUPT base. And I might work with them and I might say, you know, what's your goal? How many words would you like to create from this base? And they might say, Anne-Marie, I want to see if I can make 10 words. And what's exciting is, what if they get stuck on number 7 or 8? Because they have that personally relevant goal of trying to get to 10 words, they keep trying. And it helps them see the reason why we're working on this. This is helping me learn new words. Finally, we know that goal setting leads to substantial improvements in performance. And it boosts self-perception. So how does it boost self-perception? How does this work? Well, when students come and see an educational therapist, it's usually because they're failing in school. Things aren't going well. And they have these ideas that they're not good at things. They might come in and say, Anne-Marie, I'm just no good at math. So then what can we do? How do we change that? Well, we know that kids are kind of scientists. They have these hypotheses about the world, and they're looking for data to support or disprove their hypotheses. So we set a goal with them. Let's see if you can master your, your facts to 10. Once they hit that goal, they're able to achieve it. It shows them success in a way that's really tangible, and helps them reframe their perception of themselves. Like, wow, when I work really hard, I can actually get better at something. So how do you set goals with students? Well, I like to use the acronym SMART. And I know we were just talking about not using the word SMART. So if somebody can come up with a better acronym, I'd really appreciate it, actually. Just email me. I'd love to hear what you have to say. But here's what a SMART goal is for now. A SMART goal is it's specific, measurable, attainable. The kid can actually reach that goal. It's relevant, and it's time limited. So here's a goal from a 4th grader with dysgraphia, and he's working on this typing right now. He says, Anne-Marie, I want to type better. I want to be better at it. I want to be faster. I don't want to make as many mistakes. So is that a measurable goal? Well, yeah, he wants to type 20 words per minute, and with his program, we can tell exactly if he's typing 20 words per minute. Is that an attainable goal? Can he meet it? Because not achieving our goals can be very demotivating, because it goes back to that idea that we're looking for looking for data to support our hypothesis. So he was already typing 15 words per minute. 20 words per minute seemed like a really attainable goal. Was it relevant? Well, yeah, he's going to be able to work faster. He's going to be able to use spell check. He's going to be able to draft better. This is fantastic. And finally, it's got to be time limited. Kids are in a different sense of time than you and I are. And he said, by the end of the semester, Anne-Marie, I want to know how to do this. And you know what? He's been practicing his typing every day since he set those goals. Now you might be saying to me, Anne-Marie, this sounds really great. I'm glad there's research about goal setting. My child doesn't have goals. He's sort of given up. What do you do at that point? Well, the first thing you can ask is you say, what would you like to change? What would you like to be different about school? I just asked that question to one of my students recently because we write monthly goals together. And I have goals about writing and decoding. And he said, Anne-Marie, I think I don't want to lie as much. And it was just so interesting to hear his perception. And it was something that had come up by his teachers and his parents. But it turned out he was interested in it as too. And once he had that buy-in, we could do a really great intervention. You can ask students, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you like to be different? It's usually better with our younger students, and I actually have a magic wand in my office that I bring out. And then you could just ask this question: where do you want to start? All right, so secret number 4, self-monitoring. I want you to think about the last time you were in your car driving. What all were you looking at? The odometer, your mirrors, the cars around you to the side in front of you. You're deciding where is your car in space, and how are you doing driving your car? That's self-monitoring. And you'll notice self-monitoring goes way up as soon as you see the highway patrolman usually. But as adults, we use self-monitoring all the time. And I have to say, when we have skills that as adults we just sort of take for granted, I find that those skills are a little bit harder to teach because we just sort of take them for granted. We don't think about teaching them to students. But we know that teaching self-monitoring can lead to huge differences in performance. However, self-monitoring requires a high level of metacognition. That's the ability to think about your thinking, which means that this is going to develop it's going to be continuing to develop through the mid-20s. And for individuals with ADHD or executive function challenges, there may be a delay in the development of these skills. And that's why making this more explicit, making it more clear, teaching kids how to do it is going to be even more important. So we talked about the benefits of self-monitoring. Turns out it improves attention, performance, and completion and accuracy of homework. That sounds pretty good to me. How about you? And the times that I often start thinking about self-monitoring for my students is when I start thinking, who's working harder here right now? Is it me or is it the student? It's also a great chance to think about self-monitoring when you're noticing your child's or student's behavior in a group setting and you're really wondering how it's going. You know, my husband is a choir teacher, and he teaches young boys, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, and they were playing a music game one afternoon, and one of the little boys, who was the sweetest kid, was going around smacking the other kids on the butt. And my husband pulled him aside, and he said, Michael, why are you, like, Michael, I need you to come aside. And Michael says to my husband, Mr. Morey, I don't understand why you asked me to leave the game. He had no idea that he was going and doing this behavior. So we've got to have that self-monitoring, that self-awareness before we can do anything. So how do we do this? We can focus on kids' ability, kids' attention, have them self-monitor their attention. If you have a child who's moving around the classroom all the time, distracting their classmates, or who themselves are easily distracted, this is a great strategy. It's also great for performance of the more low-level tasks. You can have them monitor their rate of performance, their accuracy of their performance, but again, it's better for sort of the lower-level tasks. You know, how many math problems did you complete accurately tonight? It's going to be a little bit harder with, say, an essay or reading a chapter. So my favorite way to teach monitoring of attention is with the monkey mind strategy. And this is something that I created in just sort of a fit of desperation one day several years ago. And I was in a meditation class at the time, and the teacher was talking about the idea of the monkey mind. And so I introduced this idea to a second grader I was working with. Incredibly creative, so fun, so kind. But in a 55-minute session, her mind just was everywhere. And so I said to her, I said, have you ever heard of the monkey mind? And she said, no, I've never heard of this. And I said, well, it turns out our minds are just like monkeys, and they're a little bit mischievous. And I said, have you ever been in class and you've been thinking about what's for lunch later today instead of what the teacher is talking about? And she said, oh, yeah. It was like I was a mind reader that I knew this about her. And I said, well, that's your monkey mind. Our monkey mind just sort of wanders away into the jungle sometime. And that's what minds do. They wander. And what you can do is you can record, you can pay attention when your mind wanders away. And I teach students how to draw a really quick sketch of a monkey face. And this is their reminder that their mind has wandered away. And I say, you know, what do you do when your mind wanders away? Well, it's just like a little kid, a 2 or 3-year-old on the playground who starts wandering away. You wouldn't yell at them to come back, like, get back here this instant. Instead, you'd go over and gently hold them by the hand and bring them back to where they're supposed to be. And that's exactly what we can do with our own minds. When we notice it's wandered away, we can just notice that and gently bring it back. And what I always promise my students is, we'll always come back to your monkey mind. I want to hear what you have to say. Let's get this decoding done for now, and then you can share that with me. So this student has since graduated, but the monkey mind strategy has stuck with us. And this is a drawing that she did for us to share how much she loves the monkey mind. Okay, so our last strategy for helping students become more independent is something called self-talk. Can you remember the last time you lost your keys? What did you do? I'm guessing, if you're anything like me, you started talking to yourself, like, okay, so I came in last night, I walked in, where did I go first? And you start having this conversation with yourself. Well, that's self-talk. And we know that self-talk starts more external, we say it out loud, and over time it becomes more internal. But when things are tough, we tend to start talking aloud again. And we know that self-talk is a really powerful tool that helps students identify the problem they're facing, focus their attention, build independence, cope with frustrations, and develop self-confidence. I don't know about the kids in your life that you're a parent to or you're working with, but all of those things are so important for our students. And we know that for kids with learning disabilities and learning differences, that there's real differences in the way that they use self-talk. This was research done by Karen Harris, who's absolutely fantastic, and I really recommend looking into her work on self-regulation. But she did a study where she had young kids, about 5 years old, come into the lab, and she was studying how they solved a little puzzle like this. And they worked alone in a room, and they recorded what the kids were saying to themselves. So the typical kids, they came in and they sat down, and as they solved the puzzle, they coached themselves aloud. Okay, so first I'm going to look for the dinosaur's face. Okay, now I need his neck. And 85% of their coaching that they were doing was on topic. It was helping them solve the problem. In contrast, kids with LD and language impairments, 83% of their speech was unrelated. Not only was it not helping them solve the problem, but it was distracting them from the task at hand. One little girl, instead of working on her puzzle, started thinking aloud about her brownie meeting later in that day. So we want to start teaching kids about self-talk and how important it is. So here's how I recommend doing it. Here's how I do it in my practice. So first off, we just discuss the importance, that the idea that we actually are talking all the time inside of our heads, and that can help us solve problems and keep working. And then we work with students to create those self-statements, model it, practice it, and then cue students to use those self-statements. And I can't emphasize this enough. This is so helpful. So the first thing when we're discussing the importance of this is making explicit the connection between our thoughts and our feelings. And this is news to a lot of our students. So I would start by just drawing a speech bubble on the whiteboard and say, you know, this little girl is thinking, I'm so bad at math. And I ask my students to fill in the face, how do you think she feels when she has thoughts like this? And they quite readily say, oh, she probably feels sad. She feels bad about that. So then I say, well, what if that little girl has the same problem, and instead of saying, I'm so bad at math, she says, you know, little by little, I can do this if I keep working at it. And they think for a second, they go, well, she'd feel good. She'd feel happy. So we want to show them that our thoughts and our feelings are connected. And we may have automatic thoughts, but as soon as we start noticing them, that means we can start changing them. So these are all examples of the self-statements that I've used with students. And I want to talk a little bit about self-regulation in terms of writing instruction. And what we know is one of the most effective ways to teach writing is to model aloud the work, having a mentor teacher model how they're doing the writing. And I think one of the reasons why this is so important is that it's showing kids how we think through really hard things like writing. And we're showing them the self-statements that we're using. And I do this all the time with my students when I first start, like, oh my gosh, you know, I feel a little bit nervous that I'm writing this paragraph in front of my students. Okay, well, I'm just going to let my mind be free, and I'll think about this, and little by little, I'm going to be able to do this. So I think this is a great strategy that you can use with your students. You can also use these strategies with students who are older. It works for younger and older students. And I think it's most effective for coping with frustrations. And we know our kids are going to run into frustrations. It's just part of life. And this is a strategy, I was using it with a high schooler who was getting some test anxiety. And he'd study for his essay exams, and then he'd show up and he'd blank out. And so he came up with a set of self-statements that he could use when he sat in on an essay exam. And the first one was, you know, this is tough. Take a deep breath. And then he'd sort of coach himself through this. Okay, I know that this is hard work. It's actually going to help me grow my brain. You know, I've sat for essay exams with this teacher before, and I nailed it last time. So if I did it then, I can do it now. So this is a wonderful strategy for our students who just feel so frustrated and they're not sure what to do. And as a parent or a teacher, you can also prime your students. So before they sit down to do something really hard, like, you know, there's going to be some challenges you run into with this one. So what you can do is you can say to them, what are some things that you could say to yourself? What are some comments? And I love this because, especially in a group setting, students often notice their peers seem to be doing so well, but as soon as we bring this out into the open, they know, gosh, I'm not the only one who finds this tough. I'm not the only one, and I think together we can do this. Okay, so we've talked about 5 different strategies, and I would ask that you don't go home and try to do all 5 of them, because that would be way too much, but think about one. What's one strategy that you could use that could make a difference? Are you going to teach students how to reframe mistakes as opportunities for learning? Are you going to use wise language to give critical feedback as well as praise? Are you going to teach kids how to set goals and go for them? Are you going to introduce them to themselves to the idea that they can monitor their own performance? They can see how are they doing? Or are you going to uncover the idea of self-talk, that we have thoughts and those thoughts can affect our feelings? So I'd invite you, if you'd like, I'll be your accountability buddy, and email me and let me know what you've decided you're going to do, one strategy, and I promise I will get back to each and every one of you to find out how it's going. And I hope you find these strategies as helpful as I have. And I thank you guys so much for being here today. So at this time, I think what we can do is we can sort of open it up for questions.
Yeah, we can. Actually, if anybody has a question, you can go ahead and type it into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can just ask the question directly. And Mariah, I don't know if you have any questions ready, but it looks like everybody was just listening so intently. So that's always a good sign when there's not a lot of questions, because then we know everybody's actually paying attention. Let's see, we do have something.
Okay.
Okay, so do you see that one?
Yeah, I do. So a middle
Okay.
schooler that keeps falling behind on the work to the point where we're spending a few hours every night and over the weekend working on makeup work. And she's so far behind that I look forward and planning for future projects is almost impossible. Oh my gosh, this is a tough one. Also, the student has pretty severe executive dysfunction. Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first piece is already there, which is working with the teachers to sort of come up with a plan. And I feel for you because I think it's so tough. Especially, you want your child to come home from school, you want them to have time to relax, to connect with family and friends. You especially want to make sure that your child is sleeping enough every night. So how do you work on this? I think using this framework or this schema, maybe come up with some goals for students, or for the students, or for your daughter. Daughter or son? Yeah, daughter. So come up with some goals, see if she can articulate a goal about what she'd like to do and staying on top of it. And in terms of sort of the executive function piece, I would really try to pinpoint where exactly is she getting behind. Is it that she's forgetting to bring her materials home, she's not writing down the assignments, she gets started but then she can't finish, or she dilly-dallies for hours because she's so afraid of getting started. So if you can really pinpoint exactly where sort of things are falling apart, I think that can be really helpful, and then come up with a really specific goal. For one of my students, the reason why he wasn't getting his work done is he was just forgetting to bring home his materials at the end of the day. And so once we had that specific goal, then we could put in a really specific intervention. But I know it can feel like a really big challenge. So I hope that's a helpful strategy. Okay, so how about a sophomore who loses homework and doesn't follow through to turn it in? He is dyslexic and dysgraphic and has executive functioning challenges. Okay, very similar again. So again, this idea of losing homework and following through to get it in. Right, so homework is such a hassle because there's so much back and forth that has to go on. And with a sophomore too, I think that can be tough too. Well, the first thing that I like to think about with kids with ADHD or executive functioning challenges is the idea that they're going to get there eventually, but there's going to be a lag. And typically we think about that lag of being about 30% of typical kids. So if it's a sophomore, gosh, that would mean he was maybe 15. So he's 30% behind his peers. So that would mean he's maybe performing like a 12-year-old. So what kind of interventions would we put in for a 12-year-old? And that can be really helpful. I think the biggest piece that I'd recommend here is having some sort of priming system, because clearly his executive function isn't developed enough yet in order for him to come up to remember every day. So what happens at the end of the school day? Does he get a message? Does he get a text message that comes through? Does his final teacher of the day remind him? So if you can kind of pinpoint that challenge.
That's a big one too, just pinpointing
okay,
it.
I'm
Because yeah, go ahead.
It's really big. Oh no, please do, Jennifer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just have a hard time with that myself, and a lot of times for me, it's just not being organized enough to even realize how far behind I am on something. And so, like you said, identifying where that problem is really the biggest part of it before you can start to fix it,
Yeah,
So,
and I know too, I promised at the beginning of the hour that I wouldn't be talking about, interventions that you needed to buy or any services that you needed to seek out. I think sometimes with high school students, it can be really, really hard if it's a parent serving as the executive function, because you've got a child who needs that support, and yet at the same time, developmentally, they are individuating and they're doing things on their own, and that is a recipe for conflict. So at that time, sometimes it's great to get a referral for a really good ADHD coach or executive function coach. Jennifer mentioned that I write a blog. It's called baytreeblog.com, and if you go to baytreeblog.com/podcasts, and then you look up executive function, there is I interviewed a woman named Pam Scribner, who's dynamite. She is the best executive function coach in the San Francisco area, and she talks specifically about how to support high schoolers that are having these challenges, and I think she goes into great detail. So I'd really recommend checking that out.
Yeah, and one of the moms in the chat box says exactly. He doesn't want the support from me,
Yeah,
So it is tough with the kids when they're teenagers. They already know everything for number one, so they don't need you to tell them what to do. But it's tough when they just have had enough of everybody telling them what to do. So
yeah, absolutely. And then Tamsin, to answer your question, you'd find it at baytreeblog.com/podcasts, and then look up executive function. And the woman I interviewed, her name is Pam Scribner. And you can also just email me and I'll send you directly the link. And I think, was there another question up here?
let's see.
Who has progressed, somebody, a middle schooler who's progressed well but still suffers from terribly low self-esteem. Absolutely, and I hope you find these strategies really helpful. And something that I find really helpful as someone who's worked with a lot of kids who learn differently is just, when you're down in the trenches, day in and day out, it can just feel really discouraging. But if you're able to sort of move up to 10,000 feet and you get kind of the big picture, it really helps, I think, feel optimistic about your child, and that sort of optimism can pass on as well.
Yeah, that's definitely an important thing. I found that to be something that I've learned over the years because I have a son that's getting ready to turn 21 this month, and I remember going through all these things with him in school, and he had never did well in school. So I just never saw the light at the end of the tunnel. To me, that was like my whole life was going to be this whole scenario of Richard not doing well in school. And when he finally graduated, senior class president, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is over, we did it. And I think it's just really important to realize this is not a lifelong thing. These kids do develop all those skills. And it's one of those things you have to keep coming back to, sometimes every day, sometimes several times a day,
Absolutely.
and it's frustrating, but we just have to remember that this is a short time. It goes by in a flash, so we have just a little bit of time too to really work with them and help them build those skills.
Absolutely. And I think that's too why it's helpful to connect with other parents, and other people that are in the field, and making sure you've got the right teachers and the right people on your team, that feel optimistic about your child and that they're conveying that to you and they're conveying that to the child as well.
Right. Can you explain a little bit more, Anne Marie, about what exactly executive functioning is? We have a
Ooh,
question in the chat box, so
that's
can you just give us a little
yeah,
101 on
yeah,
that?
that's a great question. That could be a whole other webinar, and I imagine
Yeah,
some of you, especially on the East Coast, are probably ready to go to bed pretty soon. So executive function is a real buzz term these days, and I apologize for using it without explaining it. But it's the idea that our minds, sort of, one of the analogies people use is that our mind sort of has a symphony. It's sort of a symphony, right? There's all these different tasks that it does. And the executive function is sort of the conductor. And this is the piece that helps us set goals and achieve those goals, which sounds really simple, but it's actually quite complex. And many kids with ADHD have challenges with this. And it's the idea of, if a child has difficulties with executive function, they can have troubles with organization, prioritizing, planning, initiating tasks, following through on tasks. So again, a lot of the things we talked about today in terms of independence, if there's an executive function challenge that hasn't been addressed, that's going to really get in the way. So again, definitely recommend looking into the Dawson and Guare books. They are great. And talk about the whole brain child. I don't know what you'd like me to talk about, Mary, other than I think it's a fantastic book. I'd highly recommend it. I think it's Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson, I believe. You guys can check me on that. It's a great resource in terms of thinking about how do we help kids. It's a really short book, and I think it's got 10, 11, 12 different strategies. And one that I love teaching with my students is the idea of talking about parts of the brain, and we can talk about that we have the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain, and the downstairs brain is sort of that primitive part of our brain that makes sure we're safe and we're protected, and the upstairs brain is the part that helps us think things through, and sometimes when we get really angry or really upset, we're down in the downstairs brain and we can't really think things through. So yeah, so I definitely recommend the whole brain child to anybody. Oh, and
Perfect.
if any of you are on the East Coast, I'm from the, one of the, yeah, I belong to the Association of Educational Therapists, and they do a great annual conference every year. And next year's is in Chicago, and the keynote is Tina Bryson, so she should be fantastic to go hear in person.
Oh, that's really good. Okay, so I think we've pretty much answered all the questions. We are gonna, we did record this session, so it is gonna be available. We will have the link up on the Decoding Dyslexia website. I'll also put it in the Learning Ally chat, and you can contact us directly through Learning Ally. If you want to go to the next screen, we'll just go through a couple of the services real quick that we have. At Learning Ally, we do have parent support specialists, so you can call in, talk to another parent about any issues you might be having with school or tutoring or anything like that. We do have monthly webinars and events just like this. We just started our new youth services, and that is growing, and just it's a phenomenal program. We have student to student webinars. We have another one coming up next month. And we, of course, we have our audiobooks still, but we have just expanded the services for Learning Ally to really reach out and into the dyslexia community. So, feel free to go onto our website and poke around a little bit and see all the different things that are available. I think that's the last slide, right?
I think so.
Yeah, there we go. So if you do know somebody that needs a copy of this presentation or wants to talk to parent support, they can call us at the 1-800-635-1403 number. And let's see if there's anything else in here before we go. Um, Oh yeah, we're gonna have the Mariah just reminded me of the Spotlight on Dyslexia conference is going to be coming up in December. Save the date. It's going to be in the first week of December. We're going to have at least 20 speakers, and it's going to be an all-day online conference. So that's going to be kind of exciting too. And I think that's it. Yes, I think so. Do you have anything else, Anne
No,
Marie, that you
thank you
want to
guys all
say?
so much for having me. And if anybody had any questions or they wanted to pick out which strategy they were going to try with their child, feel free to email me. And the email is on
It's on the slides.
it's on the
Is
slides,
it?
yeah. And
Yeah,
it's info@baytreelearning.com. So please feel free to email. I always enjoy talking with other educators and parents.
wonderful, wonderful. Well, we really appreciate you doing this webinar with us, and we look forward to definitely doing more with you. This is really important stuff, and it's just hard to figure out what to do sometimes when we're in these situations. But I know the things that you suggested tonight even just made me really think about how I even deal with the way my brain processes in the monkey brain and
Yeah,
negative self-talk and all that. I mean, just to be aware of it is really something. So I really thank you for this information. And I look forward to working with you again.
thanks so much.
Thanks, Man Marie. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.